Okay, I think we're going to get started. One of our panelists is still putting a child to bed, but I'm sure she'll be here soon. So hello and welcome to Sexual Assault and Justice in the Age of Me Too. My name is Jill Witkin, and I'm a board member of Holy Blossom Temple, and I'm the Vice President of the Department of Tikkun Olam, which runs these social action programs. One of these programs is the Women's Advocacy Group. And myself and Megan Stevens, who is also on the panel today, we're both members. And our goal is to bring important topics relating to women to the forefront in order to inform and educate members of our community. And I should tell you that in my day job, I work as a Crown attorney, and I've spent most of my career specializing in sexual assault cases. I'm the chair of the Sexual Violence Advisory Group, which was formed under the previous Liberal provincial government to improve sexual assault investigations and prosecutions, and to ensure that complainants in sexual assault cases are not re-victimized by the process. And it's in this capacity that I've gotten to know Robyn Doolittle and Farrah Khan. And I also know Megan because she was Crown Counsel in the same office as me before her current position, and we also liaise on cases now, given both of our roles. I'm here in my personal capacity, not on behalf of the Crown or behalf of the government, and I'm not going to be speaking about any specific cases. But why is this topic important? In October 2017, the hashtag #MeToo made headlines internationally. It prompted women from across the world to publicly share their experiences of sexual assault or harassment. And it's been called a watershed moment in the advancement of gender equity, giving a powerful platform to women and demonstrating the extent of sexual harassment and assault across society. And the movement has certainly advanced what we're seeing in the courts. There's more education and resources that are dedicated to sexual violence. And a decade ago, we couldn't even have envisioned powerful men like Harvey Weinstein or Bill Cosby being convicted of sexual assault and being sent to jail. But not all behavior is criminal, and this is also about societal attitudes and whether they've changed, and if so, how. Do people understand the boundaries? Do people from different generations look at Me Too differently? The power of the media. You know, we've got social media at our fingertips all of the time. And so is information about sexual violence being reported in a fair and objective way? And are certain messages maybe misunderstood? Have we moved the dial when it comes to gender-based violence and harassment? I think that this is a conversation worth having, and that's why I'm really happy to be here today. Just before I introduce the panelists, there is going to be a Q&A at the end of the session. We're going to leave some time for that. If you want to ask a question, you can just go to the chat button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and type a message to me, Jill Witkin, as the co-host, and time permitting, hopefully we'll be able to pose your question to the panelists. Also at the end, at the very end, we're going to post on the screen a list of community resources, just in case you or anyone you know feels that they need to reach out to one of our to one of the community resources that could help you in the event that there's any information you need or somebody that needs to speak to a lawyer, etc. Okay, now for my panelists. Their full bios are online, and so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them, but maybe if we could have them now take out their videos so that we can see them. I'll just wait a minute for that. Thank you. Great, we've got you all here. Okay, and so Robyn Doolittle, and her name is under her screen. You will know her as the award-winning investigative journalist from the Globe and Mail. She's known for her book Crazy Town, the Rob Ford story. She's known for the Unfounded series, which we're going to talk about a little bit, and her recent book, Had It Coming, What's Fair in the Age of Me Too. I've got it here, and I can tell you it's a fabulous read. It's not for lawyers. There's no legalese in here. It's for regular people who want to understand about these issues. And it's a really, really great read. I highly, highly recommend it. Farrah Khan, who doesn't have a name under, but she's the one. Farrah, give a wave to us with the red earrings. Thank you for being here. Farrah is a renowned gender equality advocate, She manages the Office of Sexual Violence Support and Education at Ryerson, and she does a lot of consent training and work with university students and work with high school students. And she also does training for the media on the use of language in sexual assault cases, which I think is really important. So welcome, Farrah. Megan Stevens is as I said, she used to be Crown Counsel in my office, but now she's the Executive Director of the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund, otherwise known as LEAF. And she recently was one of the interveners on a case called Regina versus Sullivan, which was at our Ontario Court of Appeal. And that's about the defense of extreme intoxication in cases of violence. And so I'm going to be asking her some questions about that as well. So I want to start by going to Robyn. Robyn, you spent almost 2 years investigating police forces across Canada for your Unfounded series, and you ended up launching it. It was published, I think, in February or so of 2017, and you were looking at why or how police forces are dealing with sexual assault cases compared to other cases, and you were looking at some of the data. Can you just tell us why you decided to investigate police officers or police departments, and what did you find?
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me. I love all the women on my screen right now. They're so smart. I'm so excited to have this conversation. So I'm an investigative reporter at the Globe and Mail. I do big long-term projects. In 2015, I was trying to think of what to do next. And at the time, the Ghomeshi trial was very much at top of mind for everybody. And there was a lot of conversations happening in my world, with random people you bump into in the coffee line, in the media, about whether this system was rigged against sexual assault victims. I think that I kept having this conversation with my girlfriends as we were talking about the upcoming trial. And it got me thinking, like, that's a really interesting question. Is the system rigged against sexual assault victims? It certainly feels that way, but is it true? And this is where I ended up thinking that this is an area to investigate. And I initially was focused on the courts. How do the courts handle these cases? And I came across a report that talked about this thing, unfounded rates, where police, when they're done an investigation, they stamp the case to say whether it was a real complaint or a false complaint, a baseless allegation, an unfounded investigation. And there was this report in the UK that a huge number of people who had been accused or who had been in the courts accused of sexual assault had an unfounded allegation made against them. And I was like, oh, I'll just see what our courts are like, in Canada. And that's when I learned that actually we don't even collect or report unfounded rates in Canada. So that is where this started. I had to individually reach out to hundreds of police services. I guess actually it was about 170, I think, 1,100 police jurisdictions to individually collect this statistic. And it was so important because it kind of cuts through the noise. It's a very kind of black and white thing. You can look at sexual assault cases and say that what I found was 20% of sexual assault cases in Canada were being dismissed as a false or baseless allegation, compared with, say, physical assault, which had around 11%. All other crimes were around kind of 7%, other violent crimes. What this did was basically quantify rape culture. So that was a big piece of it, is this black and white statistic. And then on top of that, I looked into 54 specific claims of sexual assault to try to figure out that ideally didn't go to court, to figure out, like, what went wrong, what happens in a sexual assault investigation. And that's where I found that it actually didn't matter whether a case was unfounded or not. Sexual assault complaints across the board were not being treated as seriously as other types of police investigations. It was very routine for police to do things like close a case before ever interviewing a suspect, close a case within an hour of interviewing someone, not looking for witnesses, not sending evidence for forensic review, using like horrible victim shaming language with the complainants who are sitting there, and dramatically understanding consent law. And all of these kind of wound into this system of this is how rape culture is impacting these cases. So that was the foundation of where my book kind of built off of, but Unfounded is where I got interested in this area of reporting. And I promise I will make less long-winded answers from here on out.
We love hearing from you. That's okay. But I want to ask you a question. So what was the response initially from the police services? And I mean, your Unfounded investigation came out in February of 2017.
Right.
And the Me Too movement kind of started in like October of 2017. Was that good? Was that coincidental?
Well, I mean, they're kind of separate. So in the book, I actually take kind of great pains to talk about how Me Too was happening well before the movement with the hashtag started, right? I mean, Tarana Burke obviously is the one who actually founded Me Too, but we were marching towards this moment well in advance. Even in Canada, I mean, Gomeshi was huge, right? So it's not really that coincidental that it happened in the same year, but it certainly helped, I mean, in terms of getting the response. However, I will say that the series ran in February 2017, and within a couple of months, like almost every police service in the country was doing a massive overhaul of policies, procedures, and training. Now, I still have to follow up on whether those were real initiatives. I can look in the stats. I'm going to do it in 2 years. I'll give them 5 years. Don't tell them, but that's my plan. So we'll see if it's actually helping. But yeah, you asked whether the response. The response was very funny to me because 3 months before I ran the series, I emailed more than 100 police services that were really focused on in the story and outlined exactly what was in the series, exactly what their stat was, what the national rate was, what all the issues I was going to be bringing up, cases that were problematic that they were involved in or not. And across the board, they did not reply. They did not respond. I think of 100, I had fewer than 10 actual answers to my questions. And something like 12 or 13, I can't remember the exact number. I should post the link to the story because it's one of my favorite stories that I wrote in this whole series. They had they sent me the exact same email that said, we don't think it's in the public interest to respond to you. It was about 200 words long. And because they'd used the same language, I knew that they had crafted it as a group. If they had just said no comment, I wouldn't have thought it, but because it was the same, so then I filed freedom of information requests with all of those police services to get all of their emails. And I had got a stack back this high. They had a national debate among all of the communications officers across the country about how to shut down the Globe story. So to me, that just showed that their heart, they did not want this out there. They did not want to have this conversation. After the series ran, they immediately toppled like dominoes. So I think, frankly, through peer pressure. So yeah.
Okay, and so
cynical, but that was how I felt.
And so Had It Coming, your book now that I'm holding up, that sort of picked up where Unfounded left off. And why was it that you decided to write this book?
Basically just, I had no intentions of writing a book about Unfounded. Initially, because it was such a long series, like what could I bring new? But when Me Too happened, what I thought was interesting is I'd spent so much time learning about rape culture because I had not ever thought about it as a 35-year-old, well, I'm 35 now, it's like, in my early 30s woman, had not spent any length of time thinking about these issues. And, getting into Unfounded and learning about why was it that these cases were not being treated the same way. I saw so many of the conversations coming up around Me Too that I thought I could build off of knowing what I knew now or exploring what I wanted to explore. And there's some big things that, I'm really interested in the panel's discussion around this, but I was fascinated by how much of the conversation focused on the law and the fact that so many of these issues, Farrah talks about this so much in her training that, if your bar when you're talking about consent is don't go to jail, you're starting at a losing place, right? And thinking about consent and so many of these issues as ethical ones, as just, moral ones, and reframing some of these discussions and also getting into kind of what I would call the third rail issues of Me Too that we're uncomfortable talking about, things like due process. What do you do with people who have done something wrong?
Okay, so I want to go now to Megan, and I want you to, Megan, let's just talk about consent for a moment. And can you explain in, non-legalese language, what is the law of consent in Canada, just so that the audience understands? And you've got to turn your mute off.
On mute. I'm gonna mute myself.
Okay, I'm unmuting, sorry. This is the how to stay out of jail version of consent, what the law of consent is. No, so I think as a starting point, just talking generally about what the law of sexual assault is, unwanted touching of a sexual nature, that's sexual assault. And it's the unwanted part that gets us to consent. And consent does lie at the heart of sexual assault law. And so, you know, Robyn, you say this in your book, we're actually fairly progressive in Canada in terms of what our law is, what it says in the books. It doesn't always play out that way, obviously. But so consent, I think there are 4 really key points. The first is consent needs to be freely given. So that means you can't force it out through threats, even subtle threats. It can't be coerced as a result of someone's position of power. So the doctors, the teachers. A person can't consent if they're too drunk or high to understand what they're consenting to. So an unconscious person cannot consent. The second key point is consent can be withdrawn at any time. So you actually, in Canada, the law requires consent to every different sexual act. It's an ongoing thing. You can't give consent in advance. It is about ensuring, you know, there's a level of comfort that has to go with it, and that can change. The third key thing is that the law requires that persons wanting to engage in sexual activity with others need to take steps to make sure the other person is consenting. So we call that the reasonable steps requirement. And the other important point is that those reasonable steps can change depending on the circumstances. So sometimes more reasonable steps may be required. If it's someone you don't know particularly well, you don't know them sexually, there are probably more reasonable steps that the law is going to expect you to have taken. If the person's intoxicated, you probably also need to take more reasonable steps. The riskier or more invasive sexual activity, same thing, more steps. And then the fourth key point, I think, and it sort of links back to a lot of this, silence is not consent. So here in Canada, we actually require affirmative consent. And so we used to always say no means no. Really, it's only yes means yes. You need yes, silence isn't enough. So that's what I'd say the law is in a nutshell.
Okay, thank you. And Farrah, you do a lot of training, consent training at universities. So what is the message that you're giving to students?
About consent or just about sexual health in general? Because I think, you know, I try to talk to students before we get to the consent talk about sex. I think, I don't know about anybody else here, but I went to Catholic school. So, you know, we learned 3 things: don't get pregnant, condoms aren't existent, and, you know, don't get pregnant. And so those are like the big things. And so I think when I talk to students, one of the things I talk about is, you know, let's get to talking about pleasure. Let's go beyond just consent and conquest, kind of, because I think we're taught that sex is a conquest. So a lot of the conversations I have are more just around talking about, you know, how do I negotiate pleasure? How do I have pleasure with myself? And how do I have really hot sex? And if I really want to have hot sex, then everybody's got to be down, because if not everybody's interested in what I'm doing, then either I'm a bad partner because I'm not really listening to what my partner needs, or I'm also not someone who cares about the other person I'm with. So what's that about? So I think some of the conversation, we need to kind of move more into that, because so many students that come into universities and colleges don't even have comprehensive sexual health education, right? And sexual health education that's comprehensive includes pleasure. And then when we talk about the consent conversation, you know, I think for me, it's really going beyond just getting that kind of checkbox, which I think sometimes when we teach, sometimes it's consent only education, or like, you're going to jail if you don't do this, it becomes a checkbox. Or there was like an app that you could have that both of you had to sign and then you could like get down. I think we need to go beyond that. And so it's conversations about how to negotiate, how to have conversation, you know, how to tell someone I'm not feeling it, and how to deal with rejection. Because I think the thing is that everybody gets rejected, yet we don't normalize it.
And so, and clearly, I mean, Robyn, you talk about in your book the fact that not every unpleasant encounter is going to end up in the courts, right? And you touched on this before, like leaving aside the legal, what about the ethical and moral conduct? And you did some research, or you were talking to some of the researchers. What did you learn from your research when you were listening to professors and even listening to students, rather? I mean, do men and women interpret nonverbal cues the same way? What did you find?
Yeah, this was so key, this obsession with talking about consent and these issues through the legal framework. Because when you think about Me Too and what came out in Me Too, what are the predominant stories you're hearing? You're not talking about vaginal penetrative rape a lot of the time. And it's not illegal to be a douchebag. Like, that is the big thing that you find. And when we only talk about this as a legal thing, you have situations like Patrick Brown, for example, accused of sexual misconduct, sexual impropriety with young staffers, where he, maybe had there was a power imbalance. They were drinking, he was not, all allegedly. There's lawsuits here. When you read the allegations, to me, in my reading of them, I'm not thinking that this is a sexual assault. It's jerk behavior is what is being alleged here. Like, really icky, do we want this man running the province behavior is kind of what we're being alleged. And you saw the commentary around it was, well, if this is true, why didn't they go to the police? And when we, again, we're not talking about criminal behavior here, and you shouldn't have to go to the, like, what are you going to, if your boss is sexually harassing you, you're going to go to the police and say, my boss is making me feel uncomfortable at work. Like, but because we are stuck in this binary, it's legal or not, we are really limited. So that's one huge area that I'm really interested in about talking about sexual assault and consent. The other thing that you touched on is that I was really interested in when I started looking into this is, a big pivotal story for me was the Aziz Ansari story. So this is comedian Aziz Ansari. He's very famous for being, kind of like a woke guy. He writes really nuanced pieces, shows, books about the dynamics between men and women. And it was in January, so a couple months after Me Too launched, and it was this story on babe.net, which as a piece of journalism was very problematic. So let's set that aside and say that it was fine, but it was not, but it's fine. And it basically is a story recounting this woman, Grace, is saying that she went on a date with Aziz Ansari, and afterwards they went back to his apartment, and he was, pressuring her for various sexual acts. And she wasn't really into it, but she went along with it. Then she'd kind of like stop and be like, can we chill? And he'd say, yeah, for sure. It's not cool unless we're both into it. And then they were kind of like sitting naked on the couch, and then he'd try again, and she'd go along with it, but didn't feel good about it and wanted to leave, and finally said, like, you're all the same. And he called her an Uber, and they left. And to me, it was a story that seemed very familiar. There's so many, I've had sexual situations where I'm thinking, like, I'm not interested in this, but why am I not leaving? I don't know, it's impolite. Like, there's so much to unpack there. But in that story, she said, I consider this to be a sexual assault. And my reaction was, oh, I don't think that's a sexual assault. I don't know what to make of this story. And I texted some of my friends, and we had a really great discussion, and unpacking a lot of these issues where I was sad for Aziz Ansari. He was being embarrassed. They're like, why are you sad for Aziz Ansari? Why is your instinct to defend the guy? And even if it's not a sexual assault, this is the kind of interaction that we really need to be talking about right now. And by focusing purely on the legal thing, I was missing this really important conversation that I ended up having with my friends. And, but when when we're talking about, as I, in my book, was exploring consent and how confusing it can be for some things, I think this is a controversial thing to say, because I don't want to, there are men who exploit and women who exploit how confusing consent can be. But there are like real issues here around how people don't have sex saying, you said earlier, Megan, like it's yes is important, right? But people don't have sex that way. It's a negotiation through body language. And people aren't always good at reading body language. There's research that shows, if you're in a good mood, you're more likely to see things in a positive way, that your brain wants to see what it wants to see, that men are more likely to read a situation as sexual than women, that women are socialized to be agreeable and go along with things. So there is also research that shows that men are perfectly capable of understanding subtle cues, but what I'm saying that is it's messy. And when you throw alcohol on this already messy situation, it can be, I think, legitimately problematic, especially when we are so obsessed with talking to kids about consent as a yes-no situation. And if we just say yes and no, it'll be better. So that's what I'm really kind of making a plea for, is to, from an early age, start talking about this in a more nuanced way.
I do think when it comes to that conversation that we know that research also shows when young women especially, and folks that are gender non-binary, learn more about their sexual, what they want and what they feel good about and how they feel like they can advocate for themselves. When we don't make sex so shameful, people are more likely to have more pleasurable sexual experiences and also maybe more comfortable saying no. And I also think the script that we've been sold about sex, you magically just take off your clothes and you come as soon as somebody is near you. That is also something we need to challenge, because these sexual myths that are fed to young men and fed to young women, the fact that we don't have comprehensive sexual health education, the fact that porn educates people more than anything else, that sets people up to think that they don't have to have a communication. And so even when we say that's just not how sex goes, I'm like, maybe we have to change how we've been taught how sex goes. Or maybe people are having sex that way and we just not told that it's hot, and we need to change that.
So, Megan talked earlier about our Canadian laws and the fact that we have an affirmative consent standard. And certainly if you're in a situation with somebody who you don't know sexually, you do have an obligation, right, to ensure that that other person wants to do this. So, I mean, how do people stay safe when there's so much room for miscommunication as you've demonstrated? I mean, what should parents be telling their children, both female and male? And I wonder, is there, Farrah, I'm wondering what you think, is there a role here, or Robyn, for men? Do they have to get educated?
Well, I think parents need to be educated about this. I think, watch Big Mouth if you haven't yet as a parent with your kid. It's a very, very uncomfortable, very inappropriate show, but really great. But I think parents do need to know about this stuff, and they need to feel comfortable with your own sexuality and how sex is operating in your own life. Check your own biases and the ways in which you've been raised to understand sexual health, and also the way you've understood sexual violence. So if you're raised in a community where you're told that it's always the girl's fault, or it's always the gender non-binary person or trans person's fault, then we really need to check ourselves on that. Or the fact that we think, sexual violence doesn't happen to kids, or sexual violence only happens to people that are gendered as female. So I think there's lots of things parents can do. I think the other thing is that if parents don't get over their uncomfortability about sex, your kid's going to find the information somewhere else. And they're also going to do things that if something does happen to them, they're going to feel a lot of shame. So, I've worked with survivors who told their parents that they would never have sex until marriage. And when they were sexually assaulted, when they had relationships that were really unhealthy for them, they felt that they couldn't tell their parents because they were already in this double bind, because they had promised their parent that they would never have sex until marriage. And so we really need to check ourselves around those kind of things we set people up to. In terms of men, there's always a role for men. Men are impacted by rape culture just as much as women in different ways. So they're told that it's in their nature to be treating sex as a conquest. It's in their nature to sexually assault people, and that it's just boys will be boys. And that's kind of a low bar for men. I want to raise the bar for men as someone who has who's a son right now. I want to make sure that he knows that the bar is pretty high for him, and I have high expectations of how he will treat his lovers, partners, and friends.
Yeah, if I can just add, I can say that, I've been doing book events now before the world collapsed, when I was in person, people would come up to me afterwards. It was very common for me to hear from mothers with sons that they were very concerned. And I think this is one of those things where you kind of maybe roll your eyes at that and dismiss it, but it's real. That is a real concern. And so dismissing it is not helpful. And so this is where it's, well, what are you afraid of exactly? And like, let's talk through that and talk through it with your son. I think that is, like, as Farrah mentioned, this is such a big deal. So I have 2 little girls, and my husband and I talk about this, and, you know, he's a guy and is kind of like, oh, I can't imagine, like, I don't even want to think about, like, when they, you know, when they're in high school, like bringing boys home, like, I just don't, that's not going to happen. And I'm like, I hope to God, boys or girls, I hope to God it happens, like, that we need to not make them feel like they have to hide in a box for exactly the reason that Farrah said, because I encountered that in my reporting a lot of the time, that the individuals who had, you know, were saying that they'd been assaulted they were equally afraid of having to tell their parents that they'd been out drinking, or that they were with a guy, that the guy was not their boyfriend. Like, there's just unpacking all of that and having more honest conversations. And if you're sheltered, then your kids are going to pick up on that, and not know where to go, and not be given the right message. And I love so much about what Farrah talks around with talking about sex as pleasure, because if you're going to be a good sexual partner, you need to communicate with your partner. And if you're not communicating, then you're probably not doing a good job. And if you are communicating, you're getting constant consent throughout. So I think just, we need to change. Kids need to learn from a young age about the concept of consent, not in a sexual context at the beginning, of course, but as you move through the system. But yeah, I would love an answer for it, because I can tell you, mothers and fathers, but we're very concerned about there's this image of, like, they're gonna get, you know, I'm a feminist, I'm a progressive, me too, I got my pink pussy hat on, and I'm a little bit afraid of my son being falsely accused in university. Like, that's a real thing.
Can I just quickly jump in? Yeah, I do think it's a real concern, but I think exactly what you both have said is so important. I do think we need to teach our sons that actually, to be great partners to whomever they want to be partners with, they need to communicate about it, and that will make them the killer guy that all the girls or all the guys will want to come to, right? Because they'll be known for being that awesome communicator who knows exactly how to push all the right buttons that you want pushed. So I think that's an awesome tip. And I also think we have to call out the horrible myths and stereotypes that still we see in every form of pop culture that we watch. I would say during the pandemic lockdown, I've got 3 kids, and a range of ages. The youngest one gets exposed to totally inappropriate stuff too early because she's the 3rd child. But we'll watch these movies that, you know, my husband and I loved growing up, and you'll see these horrible things that, like, you know, 15 years ago felt totally normal, and you see it played out now. And so sometimes I'm like, we've got to stop and have a conversation about how this is wrong. And I might sometimes be a bit of a killjoy at home, but I actually think it's important to kind of point out that it's not okay to objectify people in that way, and it's not okay to you know, talk about people like total conquest, or to do the slut shaming that goes along with certain people dressing certain ways, because those stereotypes get so ingrained in people. And we see those are the stereotypes that we're still seeing judges, when these matters do make their way into their courts, it still exists there. So I think we have to work hard with, like, our kids, our sons and our daughters, to fight against those stereotypes.
The like, alcohol is the other big piece of this, and I think especially, you know, when we're not educated on sex and don't talk about it, like, how many kids in university or something are nervous to go out and have those interactions, so they get plastered to have the courage. And, you know, maybe you don't remember what happened and you're scared. Like, this fear of talking about it is creating a problem. The lack of actual conversations around what sex is really like from a consent perspective is causing problems. But when you talked about, you know, just these messages that we're getting through media, when I was doing Unfounded, I covered a trial that Jill was the crown on, which is, I think, where I met you. And it was a really, like, it was a horrible case, and it was very sad, but this woman was out at in the club district, and within 15 minutes, got separated from her friends, went to a different bar. Jill, you can let me know if I'm misstating the state of the facts here, but was extremely intoxicated. Within 15 minutes of walking into a bar, a man had grabbed her and was physically pouring vodka down her throat. You could see it on video, and then carried her out of the bar, again, within 15 minutes of meeting her. And I say quite literally carried because she couldn't walk, brought her to a hotel, and raped her. I can say raped because it was a guilty, because Jill won the case, but there happened to be a video of her basically asleep in the elevator. And I just remember watching that and like the video and then looking over at the accused and being like, what is going through your mind when this woman is asleep? And around the time that I was covering this trial, I happened to rewatch the movie The 40-Year-Old Virgin, which was one of my favorite movies in university. Hilarious, right? Super carefree. I have some noisy men on my street. Hopefully maybe they want to talk about rape culture. Excuse me, fellas. Anyway, I was rewatching the movie, and there's this scene where Steve Carell, the 40-year-old virgin, goes to a club to learn how to get laid for the first time, and his friend actually tells him, go find the drunkest woman in the bar. Like, that's how you have sex for the first time. And these are the messages that we're getting. So that's where we need to just like slowly unravel all of this stuff.
So let's just talk about sexual assault and intoxication for a minute. And Megan, you described earlier the law of consent and how intoxication plays into it. Obviously, if you are so intoxicated or in a state of unconsciousness that you don't understand what's going on, you're not capable of consenting. But let's switch it, because we did talk about the media and how the media has an impact on things. And after I ask Megan, I want to go over to Farrah to ask her some questions about what she's been teaching the media. But Megan, what about the law of intoxication with respect to accused persons? Okay, like when is intoxication a defense? And I ask because there is the recent case of Virginia versus Sullivan that just came out of the Court of Appeal recently. And there was a lot of buzz about it in social media. I know my kids were talking about it, and people were, texting and emailing. Can you just explain first of all, what the defense of extreme intoxication is, and in a nutshell, what the case said, and what does it mean now, and what doesn't it mean?
So this was a case that I acted for Leaf on the intervention in the fall on this, and it was quite frustrating, because if you'd asked me 6 weeks ago, what's the law of intoxication with respect to accused person, I think that there would be it wouldn't be as complicated as it feels like it is now. And complicated in part because I think both the mainstream media and social media ran away with this case. And ran away with this case and started to spread information about this case that I think was really triggering for a lot of survivors of sexual assault. In that there were headlines saying intoxication is now a defense to sexual assault. And that's just wrong. That's not what this case decided. It's not what was even at issue in this case. So this case, and I'm going to step back to talk about how we got to the case, because it actually goes back to a law from 25 years ago that Parliament had passed. And in Canada, it has never been a defense. Intoxication has never been a defense to certain types of violent offenses like sexual assault. And there was a case back in 1994 that went to the Supreme Court of Canada in Regina versus Davio. It was a case out of Quebec involving Mr. Davio, who was an alcoholic and got extremely drunk, and then violently sexually assaulted an elderly woman who was wheelchair bound. He basically ran the defense of intoxication at trial, but what he said is, I was so intoxicated that I actually had no control of my conduct. I was in a state akin to automatism, so my body was acting, but I wasn't controlling it. And also that I couldn't form, in criminal law, you need the mens rea, or the mental state, as well as the actus reus. I couldn't form the mental state required to be guilty of this offense. So it makes its way up to the Supreme Court of Canada, where ultimately the majority finds the common law rule that prohibited him from raising that defense of intoxication was unconstitutional because they ultimately found it interfered with his charter rights to the presumption of innocence and a bunch of other complicated charter rights. So Parliament reacts and enacts this law in 1995 and they do so after considering the impact of this decision. There was a big outcry and a lot of concern about that decision. And they look at the impact of intoxicated violence on women and children in particular. And they look at sort of balancing rights and ultimately decide, we're going to enact a provision in the criminal code that will say, where you take steps to consume intoxicants to the point where you are so completely out of control that you no longer have control over your conduct, and then you commit a violent offense, in those circumstances, you won't be able to use this defense. So that was the issue that made it to the Court of Appeal in Regina and Sullivan, and there was another case in Chan. And ultimately, it was the same question about the constitutionality that had come up in the Supreme Court of Canada. But it wasn't for the defense of intoxication writ large in all circumstances. It really is limited to those cases where an accused would be so extremely intoxicated that their actions were not considered voluntary, where their body could act, but their mind was not controlling it. So the court did find, as media reported, that the law was unconstitutional. So it now does open the door to this defense being available. But I think what's important for people to understand is that it really should be a rare defense. It shouldn't come up that often. And the courts have said you will actually have to bring expert evidence forward in order to make out the defense. So there are sort of a number of hurdles that should limit this particular defense. It doesn't mean that I don't think there are real problems with the court's decision. I think it is really troubling, the message that it sends, and I think in particular feels like another example of sending a message to, and I'm using the language of women because more often than not it's women who are the victims of sexual violence, but it seems to be, it's your responsibility to sort of police yourself and watch out for what these crazy men will do that we can't control, and we can't hold them responsible for that. We're going to hold you responsible for watching out, control your behavior and your conduct, and beware of them. So I think that's really troubling. And I think it's also really troubling because I think as much of Robyn's work points out, and as much of what we have learned about the courts tells us in terms of sexual violence, the courts have not exactly done a great job, despite having progressive laws in this country, of showing women and complainants in sexual assault cases that justice is easily attainable. And I think this is another example that sends a message to people that there will be borderline cases. We know this defense will be run in those borderline cases, and that's going to be difficult for women. And they have legitimate concerns, I think, given the past history in the system, to think that will be dealt with fairly. But I also think it has the potential to discourage people from even wanting to come forward and report if they think they might have to deal with this as a possible defense. And I'm also concerned because the misinformation that's been circulating about the defense being available may also discourage people from coming forward if they think it's available in all cases. So that was a bit of a long answer, but it's a complicated case. And I do think it's important for people to realize it's not sort of that this is now intoxication will be run in all cases. It should be in limited cases.
And women or people should still come forward if they feel that they were sexually assaulted and that they weren't capable of consenting.
Exactly.
Farrah, you have, just talking about the media, you have started a campaign called Use the Right Words. And this is essentially, as I understand it, it's education about the use of language. Because how we describe a case about sexual assault can have a huge impact on how the reader or the listener interprets it. Can you talk a little bit just about what that means and what you've done with the media, and maybe just give a few examples?
Sure. So in 2011, article came out that I was featured in by the Toronto Star that was supposed to be a feature on the work that I do in the community, but ended up categorizing me as a tragic victim of child sexual abuse. And that was the whole focus. And it was supposed to be about my activism. And so I was really frustrated by that. And we had been working in the field for about a decade and started talking to other feminists. And so we came together and started a group called Femifesto, where we spent from 2011 till 2014 looking at the way in which the media in Canada wrote about sexual violence. So we looked at Global Mail, we looked at Toronto Star, we looked at National Post and other media sources to really look at how they were speaking about it. And what we found was rape culture was embedded in the way these conversations were happening online. And so we started this campaign called Use the Right Words. It's a hashtag that's used on Twitter where people can rewrite or rememe, we call it sometimes, headlines to actually speak to what it should be talking about. And so it's, it's thinking about, an example was a headline that said, sexual assaults are happening in this community. Women are urged to walk in pairs. And what we said, we rewrote it and said, men are urged to stay home. And so just rethinking how the conversation needs to be. So it's not always focused on victimhood. I think another example, the New York Times a number of years ago did a story about an 11-year-old girl who was gang raped by a number of men in the community. And she, in it said like she was a spider who lured men into her web. This was an 11-year-old girl. And so, it was an example of how we were exactly how Black young girls, how girls are specifically blamed for when they are sexually assaulted and the hypersexualization of young Black girls. And we see that in Canada a lot, more with Indigenous girls in terms of the media. So an example, Tina Fontaine was a young girl who was killed. And when she was killed, the Hamilton Spectator continuously wrote about her as dead girl in the headlines instead of calling her by her name. And so what I did is use the guide, and I did it with a collective of other feminists, including Shannon Jotsopoulou and Sasha. We got together and we made this guide for the media that started being used across Canada by journalism schools and then started being used in the US and got translated into French and Turkish. And it's been really exciting to see it be used. And it's a term that we can use the right words to not just push around language, but also about imagery. So just this week, we had a tragic death of two little girls from Montreal. They were not death, they were killed by their father. We believe. And the picture that was used to illustrate these stories continuously, it was of the father smiling. And it was really interesting that of the same week, a young Black man was killed, and the picture that was used for him was a mugshot. And so we really see how racism also plays into these conversations. And so that's something that we have always tried to name. We're coming up with our new guide this year, so it's exciting, but it's definitely something that I think is important because the way that language is used shapes our understanding of who is to blame for the violence, who is should be ashamed, and what institution should be called in. And usually institutions are seen as fallible.
Farrah also talked a lot about, the media, and I found I did this until I started thinking about this because of Farrah's work, that whenever media wrote about a sexual assault, it was always an alleged sexual assault. Mm-hmm. But if someone's house was robbed, it would be, there was a robbery. And when you really unpack that, why is that? And I also found there was this reaction from journalists because we internalize so much of the rape myths and stereotypes that you are looking for, okay, I want to cover this story. But, is she a sex worker? Okay, that's more complicated. Was she drunk at the time? You mentioned Tina Fontaine, my paper, the Globe and Mail, we stepped in it awfully because we had a headline that, called mentioned Tina Fontaine, she was inebriated. She's a child, right? And we weren't the only ones. Just media, it's almost like we don't recognize our power because we're, you're stretched so thin. It's just one person at a desk kind of hammering out a headline or picking a photo, and just, we need to be so much more deliberate and thoughtful and held to account for the types of decisions that we're making on these things and how we talk about sexual violence and race.
And I think that
other issues.
but I think what you're raising too is that you also get police reports, right? So I know that journalists get police reports, and those police reports are very clear. And so the SIU in Ontario refuses to change this, but every other crime the SIU reports doesn't allegedly.
Special Investigation Unit, just for people that don't know, the SIU, they investigate the police.
Yeah, so they call every list of crime, they don't say alleged, except sexual assault. And sexual assault is the second highest crime reported in Ontario by police officers.
And it's funny because people will say, oh, but it's different because it's only one story against the other story. And that's most crimes. Most crimes are one story against another story, right? And this kind of goes back to, if I can just kind of circle back to Megan talking about the Sullivan case. So I was very concerned when I saw that judgment. And the reason for me was that I understand the legal reasons of why it's fine, right? And why we don't need to panic. But when I was doing my reporting, I looked at 54 cases. That's a very small number of cases. I think there are something like 20,000 cases reported every year in Canada. Like, it's a huge number, right? So of the 54 that I looked at, I personally saw a case where in the report, the officer, as a reason for not proceeding with a charge, was because the guy was also drunk. So they could not proceed, I shouldn't even say proceed with a charge. They didn't investigate the case, right? The complainant made a charge, her parents brought her in, they interviewed her, in 30 minutes decided they were not going to continue. There were witnesses. When I was able to obtain the police file, right, to go through it all, two of the witnesses that they eventually, because the parents freaked out when they closed the case and they had to reassign it and reinvestigate it. Two of the witnesses that night heard the individuals talking about raping a woman in the car while it was happening. Like, there was stuff, someone walked up to them in the car when this was happening, right? So there was stuff here. They decided not to interview any witnesses or a suspect or do forensic testing because he was drunk, and that if he was also drunk. So police, like, across the board, misunderstood consent law. Like, I found so many cases where they said they were concerned, well, you didn't fight back. One officer said to a woman, but there was someone outside. Well, it's not like your nylons were torn, suggesting that she clearly didn't fight back because the guy didn't rip her nylons off of her. One of the lead stories in my series was a woman, Ava. The officer said to her, when, did you consent? And she said no. And he's like, well, the thing is, like, we found your underwear. Okay, well, there was discharge in it. So what else could that possibly mean besides she had biologically consented because there was discharge in her underwear, right? Like, this is what we're kind of dealing with. And this was not one or two cases. This was a huge number of them. So that's my concern, is when you see cases like that it's not even going to make it to the courts because the police are the gatekeepers of whether they actually do a proper investigation. And you can do an investigation and it not be good, right? But you've ticked all the boxes, you've interviewed someone, like, to go above and beyond. I found when a case was clear cut, when it's a young innocent woman, she was sober, it's a man, if there's racial dynamics, especially, like, there's all these elements that fit all our ideas of what a sexual assault is supposed to be, what a victim is supposed to be. Police can go above and beyond to try to get their guy. If it's more complicated, they don't.
Go ahead. Sorry, Robyn, go ahead.
No, that's kind of the end of it. So that's the cases like this I think are tricky.
Yeah, and certainly there's, in the criminal courts, there's all sorts of issues. There's, high standard of proof. There's embedded myths and stereotypes. But there is research that's being done, and there is a lot of education that is taking place even for police. And a lot of that, I think I credit you, Robyn, for the Unfounded series, because I think police are getting more educated, and criminal justice participants are getting more educated, even about things like counterintuitive assumptions, right? You assume that if somebody's being sexually assaulted, they're going to yell and scream and cry out, when the research is telling us that that's not necessarily the case. And I know in your book you wrote about Dr. Lori Haskell. She does a lot of research in this area. She's training police officers, crowns, defense judges, etc. And that's really important research that is getting to our courts. And so hopefully there will be a shift. Do you think that we have, I mean, Farrah, do you think we've moved away from rape culture to consent culture?
No. No. I think we still don't have comprehensive sexual health education in every province across Canada. So, that's one example. We still have this huge uproar about people freaking out about sexual health education, and it's used as a wedge conversation when we have elections. So, that alone tells me the fact that sexual assault is still occurring. I think, do I have hope? Sure, I have hope. I just don't want to see sexual assault consistently seen as like a political partisan issue that I have to wait until certain government's in power for things to really move again. Like that's a problem for me. So I think that's a challenge. Do I have hope for possibilities? Absolutely. But I think the challenge I will see is this going to be a long-standing thing we'll put energy towards? Because the thing is that just, Robyn and I have had this conversation, will the media be interested in these stories as much after a while? Probably not, because there's other stories that they need to tell. So how do we keep the public pressure on this to continue to ensure that we are funded as, not-for-profit organizations, that people actually get the help that they need? And how do we push the conversation even further to be like, what my concern is? Young men who do get accused of sexual violence, but don't get criminalized, so they don't go to the criminal courts, but they're accused of it. They sometimes get radicalized in this way around this idea that all of a sudden, feminism is bad. They're all out to get me. We see an uprising that we're seeing radicalization of young men around this. And so how are we dealing with that? How are we putting energy towards that? I'm interested in those kind of things, and that will take money and time and energy that goes outside of policing and law. And that is a hard conversation because everybody's obsessed with solving things with the law, and I don't think that's where we need to go. No offense to the two wonderful lawyers in this conversation.
Of course. This goes well beyond the courts, that's for sure. And you certainly have touched on the need for education and the need for conversations, the need for people to talk to one another and to really understand about human interactions and pleasurable interactions, as you've described. If there are any questions from any of the attendees, please send them to me now. I so far don't see any in my chat, but yes. Are there? I'm sorry, I don't see them.
There's one from Megan, because Robyn and I are not lawyers.
Oh, the first one I'm going to do. Okay, so the first one is, do we need any further laws to deal with sexual assault and encourage women to report? So I actually think the state of the Canadian law in terms of what we have on our books is pretty good. I actually think the affirmative requirements for consent are pretty good. I do think we talked about education in terms of the police. That's a huge problem. And I share your concerns, Robyn, around complicated cases like Sullivan. There's an easy way to interpret it if you're a police officer wanting to move a case off your desk. But I also think we really need education for our judges. A lot of judges who end up on the bench have probably never practiced criminal law. Sexual assault law is actually really complicated. We haven't even, touched anything like third-party records applications or prior sexual history.
We need about 2 hours for that, so
yeah,
we're not
exactly. That'll be next week. But so I think people just need to learn what these laws are. And there's actually a bill before Parliament right now, which would require mandatory training of judges with respect to sexual assault. Leaf made submissions about that particular law. I think it's generally good. I think it needs to go a bit further than it actually does in terms of what's on paper. So I don't think we necessarily need more laws. I think women need to believe the laws are going to be properly applied, and that will help them come forward and report.
The only other thing I'd add is that people who face sexual violence shouldn't always report, I guess. So that's my only other, like, when you talk about, like, we want to encourage people to report, I think of this all the time in my life. If my friends or my, like, God forbid, my daughters, I don't know if I would recommend it or not. It's not a good process. You have to, everything in a trial is public record. If you encounter something later on in your life that you become newsworthy, I can pull that file and read a transcript of the most horrible experience of your life.
But
So
I just want to clarify that when you are a complainant of sexual assault, your identity is protected. It's not published. It's not allowed to be published. So the story itself might be published, but not your identity.
right.
So
That's a good point. My only thing would be that I don't know if we necessarily should encourage people to come forward, but we need to build up supports within communities, counseling sessions, crisis centers, the work that Farrah, and those are not where we're directing our money. And that's, I think, a big problem.
And also normalize the idea that lots of people don't report. So less than 10% of people report. And so it doesn't make you not a survivor. It doesn't make you someone who experienced the horrific nature of sexual harassment, just sexual, and the range of it, right? Because the majority of us experience things like sexual harassment. We don't experience penetrative rape. And so that's really important to know too. And doesn't make you not a survivor just because you did not go to the police. And I think that's something I really want to drill home. And I think there's a better phrase than drill home.
I just want to also add, I think it's a totally personal decision. I have 2 daughters. I wouldn't want to see them go through that process. I found it's pretty horrifying. And so I think but if you are going to come forward, you need to have all the information about what it's going to be like, and you should know everything about what the law actually is, so that that choice is an informed choice, and you know what you're getting into.
And I should tell you that in Toronto, the provincial government does have an independent legal advice program. It's on the Ministry of the Attorney General website. So if there was someone who has been sexually assaulted in either, I think the pilot areas are Toronto, Ottawa, and Thunder Bay, and they want some free legal advice from a lawyer who can talk to them about, the different doors that they could go through and what the experience would be like, they can get 4 hours of free legal advice. We are trying. I know that the criminal justice system is trying to do better. There are, testimonial accommodations for complainants. There are some pretty strict laws that are, really taken seriously. And I think more so now than Robyn, even when you're doing your initial reporting. So I completely understand and appreciate what the panelists are saying, but I don't want the message to be that people should not go to the police and complain. It doesn't mean that you necessarily will be testifying in a trial, but the authorities are there. And at the end, and I think we are coming to the end because it's 9:07, we're just gonna, as I said, we're gonna put up a slide with some resources, the Barbara Schleifer Clinic, LEAF, Toronto Rape Crisis Center, and Boost, which is for children, just in case anybody wants to take down the information. It will be on the Women's Advocacy Group website as well, on holyblossom.org. And was there another question that has not been answered? Because I can't.
I could do a lightning round of these.
Yeah, we can do it. Let's do this.
Do lightning. Okay.
Let's do it.
What should a woman do if she's unhappy with a police officer? This is a really difficult question, and the longest answer. You can complain to their boss. You can go to, there's various police accountability bodies.
The OPIRD in Ontario, which is the Ontario Police.
Review board.
Police response part. So yeah, you can go to the media. The challenge is, as Farrah mentioned, like the bandwidth in newsrooms is really small. So it's got to be, it sounds awful, but I get calls at least a couple times a month still of people who have had their cases bungled. And it's hard to say to someone, but like, where does this fit into, the next level? Like it needs to be more than just one, and that's horrible, but that's reality because it happens so often. But yeah, often there's nowhere to go except the people who are like really, really stick with it and go to the supervisors. They are paying attention to this now. Media, you have Twitter, like this is real, so that can work. What do you think university administrators should play in ensuring justice? So yeah, what do universities do? I mean, better consent training, understanding. There's a million, fund their programs better.
I think I'm university administrators. So I'm leading a project, a national project in Canada called Courage to Act. You can look it up at couragetoact.ca. It's with administrators from across Canada looking at how we can change the conversation on campuses and how we need to change actually how we adjudicate these cases. So university administrators need to look at how they adjudicate cases, who they're hiring for these cases. Please don't hire somebody that just worked in residence for a year and now is the head of your sexual assault unit. You need to pay people adequately and stop putting people on contracts. There's a lot of things that need to be happening, but you can demand that. You can talk to folks. I would really look at the report that we put out because it gives a lot of really clear feedback around this. But the one thing that university administrators need to do is just not have one conversation at the beginning of orientation week and think it's done. And also need to fight for comprehensive sexual health education in grade schools and high schools, because if it doesn't exist, then you're not going to have consent education in universities. And the last one, there's no men on the panel because we're really awesome. And then the next question, I think there's one more question.
Screwing up men's idea of understanding.
Pornography, my friend. I think, you know, you're right around, I think what we're feeding to men is what the idea of what sex should be to them. I think we're doing a disservice to men too. So when I work with young men, they quietly come up to me afterwards and they're like, okay, like, am I supposed to know what I'm doing with my girlfriend? Or like, how am I supposed to know this thing? And they're watching porn because we're telling them that that's the way to be a man. So we need to challenge our ideas of what we're force feeding to young men about masculinity, force feeding to men about what sex has to be, and force feeding to men what their bodies have to look like. And so I think what we do really well is we have porn literacy conversations with our young people. We ourselves get porn literate. So we know what's fake, what's real. We don't pretend that our kids are not watching porn because we know like 80% are, 80 to 90%. And we don't pretend we don't watch porn. So if you watch porn, like what kind of porn are you watching? Are you thinking about ethical porn? Are you paying the porn performers? All those things.
That's all.
Okay. Well, I want to thank the panelists so much. I know you all have young children at home, and so of course, as good women, you're multitasking, but I want to thank you for attending and for providing us with your very, very intelligent and thoughtful perspective on all of this. Thank you to Deanna Levy and Amy Lester behind the scenes for running the Zoom link, and most of all, thank you to the participants, everybody who's there watching. We hope that you got something out of this, that it's maybe a bit thought-provoking. Again, thank you for everyone in joining in. We're going to, I think, close it. We're going to close now, or Deanna's going to put up the list of resources that I referred to before, but stay on the line if you want any phone numbers, and that will be posted on the Women's Advocacy Group website tomorrow as well, with a little bit more detail about each of those organizations. Thank you to everybody.
Thanks for having me. This was so great. Pretty heavy Monday night. So
Yeah, it is.
People do some self-care tonight, have a dance party, hug a cat, hug a dog, watch an otter swim. There's a baby otter video on TV right now. I mean, on Twitter right now. That's TV for me.
And buy the book, Robyn's book. It's really great. It talks about all the things that we've covered here.
okay.
Great.
Bye.
Thank you.